Okay, we are going to get started. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman. For those of you who might not know me, I'm the senior rabbi here at Temple Israel. And I just want to say we have great congregations and community here in Minnesota. And the co-sponsors, were truly honored to be included and to have them included in this moment and in this evening. We are really honored and in celebration. So we're bringing all of these co-sponsors here with all of you who represent our community of these sponsors. We just are one community, one family. It's just beautiful. I want to recognize that we are so proud to hold this event, not only because we have really the person who opened up Mussar to the contemporary world, especially to the more liberal aspect of Judaism, that there is amazing kind of insight into a tradition that really was not thriving after the Holocaust. So many Mussar sages and teachers died in the Holocaust, that Mussar almost died in the Holocaust. And so it's Alan Morinis that has brought Mussar to us in North America for sure and into the world. And it's Julie Dean who brought Mussar to Minnesota. So we want to thank the two of them. Our mission here at Temple Israel is that we bring a Jewish lens to the ever-changing world. And the Mussar lens of Judaism has really brought to us in this 21st, and I would say 22nd, 23rd century, the real insight into what it means to have an understanding of looking at character traits and grappling and wrestling with their dual definitions. That is something I have loved about learning about Mussar, the idea of leaning into the hard, difficult realities of the world and to not shy away from them, but to find strength in that controversy, into the dilemma, into the complicated, and to make sure that we have a Jewish voice in leaning in, confronting, and making sure that we don't have only the desire, but also the reality that sits side by side and closely helps us traverse this complicated world. We might not like the complicated world. We might wish it was different, but it isn't. Sorry. It's our world. It's our dilemmas. It's our crises. It's our challenges. They are ours, and we have to meet them. That is our place in this world, so that we can have not only a legacy, but provide the future into what we hand over to our collective children and to our collective grandchildren. And so for me, to shy away from it, to say it's too hard, to shake our heads and say, how did this happen, is not a luxury we have. It is not a luxury we have. And somebody's calling us. I'm sure Phyllis, God is calling us, Phyllis, and telling us that we need to step up to the plate. And that's what Mussar is all about. It's about stepping up to the plate. It's about going deep inside ourselves, but not to stop there. It is only to go deeply into ourselves to make a difference in the world. As I like to say, we have to listen in stereo to the world. We have to know what's coming at us, but we have to know how it is affecting us. And then when that effect, we can actually find a way to respond that's thoughtfully, that is a choice, not a reaction, and that is truly about finding our spiritual presence. Whether we react right or wrong, we learn from both. We learn from our successes, but we always learn from our failures, and that's what it means to be human. We all feel shame and upset. We all feel disappointment in ourselves and in things around us, and we all feel joy and pride and a sense that we are in awe of the world, and they all sit at the table. We don't have to give shame the first seat or the head of the table. We have to allow its place because it's human to feel guilt and shame. Because if we don't feel those things, then we just get rigid and we aren't human. But we don't have to give the bad feelings the head of the table. We can relegate them to the side. And then we can bring them all together, because as a whole person, that's what it means to feel all those disparate, conflicting feelings. And Mussar is the place that gives voice to all of that in Judaism in a most remarkable way. Mussar is truly the place that speaks to how we understand our character development, how we find ourselves truly, deeply inside ourselves in order to go out into the world. And Shabbat, on top of that, gives us the time to stop, to think, to relax, and to separate ourselves from the technology of the world that has taken over. I actually am giving you my own confession. Too much time, too much energy. And it allows us to separate in order to muse over the lessons that Mussar is here to teach us. And so the Shabbat effect of Mussar is a beautiful gift. It's a gift that we have been given. You all have been incredible advocates and cheerleaders for Mussar. You have activated, many of you have led, some of you are learners. We all are teachers and learners throughout. And it is in this moment that we get to hear two of the people, one we know better than the other, Julie Dean, who we love and respect and care for, in conversation with Alan Morinis. It is a gift, it is poetry, it is Mussar. And so I will now welcome them to our bima in order to continue this program. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Hi. What a joy it is to be here together. I'm Julie Dean, and the founder and executive director of Living Mussar, a nonprofit organization here in the Twin Cities dedicated to the sharing of Mussar learning and practice. And tonight we gather together to do something increasingly rare and increasingly necessary, to sit together as a pluralistic Jewish community, to learn together, and to be reminded of what we're capable of becoming together. I want to thank Rabbi Zimmerman for her beautiful opening and for her steadfast support of Living Mussar, and to Temple Israel. Thank you for hosting this magnificent space, for the security, the staff, the suites, and for hosting our clergy and facilitator workshop tomorrow. Also, a special thank you to Wendy Schwartz for her partnership in organizing this evening, and to the AV setup, and to the catering team. Woo! Tonight is made possible, as Rabbi Zimmerman mentioned, by a meaningful collaboration of congregations. And this is really important because everyone's coming together to make this happen. So we thank Mount Zion, Beth Jacob, Adath Yeshurun, Shir Tikva, Beth Shalom, Maim Rabim, and Bethel. You are true champions of this growing Mussar community. And thank you to Barry Epstein and to Phyllis Kahn, to Jody Seltzer and Robin Allwind for being role models of generosity. A little choreography. You each received a 3x5 card when you came in and a pencil for this evening. If you feel inspired to ask Alan a question, please jot it down at any point. Before the Q&A, we'll pause and several people will walk down the aisles and collect those questions. And if you don't have a question, then you can just drop off your card and pencils in the basket on your way out to the dessert reception. A question for everyone. If Mussar has touched your life in any way, please raise your hand. Keep it in the air and look around the room. You're even invited if you want to stand up and look around the room. This is what happens when one person's commitment to recover a nearly lost tradition meets a community ready to receive it. I'd like to introduce you to our guest this evening, Alan Morinis. Alan, the first time that I read Everyday Holiness, something lit me up, not just for myself, but because I could feel its greater implications for our community and for Jewish life as a whole. Through studying Mussar, I've found the language, the wisdom, and the practice to cultivate my inner life and discovered that inner work doesn't stay inside. It ripples, and it ripples. Over the past 12 years, that ripple has grown into congregations and leadership teams, couples groups, and communities of engaged learners deepening their connection with themselves, each other, and Jewish spirituality. I recall telling you in 2015 that I thought we'd work together someday. And I didn't know how, but I just felt it in my kishkas, and here we are. I have the privilege of co-authoring the curriculum with you for your new book, The Shabbat Effect. And Alan, it's a joy to welcome you back to the Twin Cities. I'd like us to dedicate this evening of learning to the Mussar teachers of the past, those who paved this path long before us, and especially to your mentor and teacher, Rabbi Yechiel Yitzhak Per, of blessed memory, without whom none of us would be here tonight. Now, if you'd like to have a seat, I'm going to tell them a little more about you, and then I'm going to get out of the way. Alan is a Rhodes Scholar who received his doctorate from Oxford University, and his own deep spiritual journey led him to discover Mussar, a profound and nearly lost tradition of Jewish spiritual practice. He sought out Rabbi Yechiel Yitzhak Per, one of the last living teachers of an unbroken Mussar lineage, and became his student. That journey became his first book, Climbing Jacob's Ladder. In 2004, he founded the Mussar Institute and then published the modern Mussar classic, Everyday Holiness, followed by Everyday Holy Day and With Heart and Mind. Tonight, we celebrate his newest book, The Shabbat Effect. One more thing before I turn it over to Alan. In getting to know you, I have discovered that you have a deep love of family, a deep love of humanity, a wonderful sense of humor, and a sweet little miniature dachshund named Dr. Pepper. So please join me in welcoming Alan Morinis.
No, that's really something, because my journey started with the collapse of a business. Who knew it would get to this point? Like, from that very dark point in my life where I was 47 years old, and really between up to my 47th year, things had gone extremely well for me. In fact, at that point, I thought the way life went is this. you're born, you succeed, you die. That was what it looked like to me. And then I was running a company at that point. It collapsed. I felt really at sea. I was bereft. I was rudderless. I didn't have an inner guidance system. I had been making it up as I went along. I went 47 years really quite successfully making it up as I went along. And then I, because of that whack in the head and the heart and the tuchus and the guts, I went searching. And this is the result of that, which is really interesting because it came out of a fall in my life. And it says in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, it says, one place it says, you will circumcise your heart. And in another verse it says, God will circumcise the foreskin of your heart. And that metaphor is only used twice in the Torah. It's in Deuteronomy, those two times. And it's interesting because of the difference between the two, which is relevant to talking about Mussar, because the first one says, you will initiate yourself. You will do the work. This is an instruction from God. You're commanded to cultivate your inner life. That's what I understand to be that metaphor of circumcise your heart. Open up your heart. Initiate yourself spiritually. Initiate your inner life. Do that work. But the way life works is that it's not all like that. It's not just all what you can do. Sometimes a 2x4 whacks you, and there are things that happen. And there's nobody in this room who hasn't suffered a loss, a failure, a disappointment, a betrayal. And as the rabbi was saying, that, we wish the world were different. Maybe, but maybe that's part of the journey too. And in fact, the fact that Torah uses this one metaphor in two ways is telling us something about the journey, about life, that it's good to work on yourself, but don't think that's the only way you're going to learn. So I'm astounded, really, to be here and sharing with you and having something to say and having written 5 books in this area and so on, because it all began in such a different place. And this is healing for me. And not that I'm still suffering from that. I got over it. That was a bit of mishigas in my life, that I was involved in that in the first place. But no, but it's good. And part of what all this is a rediscovery. Julie and I were talking about the fact that the book, Mesilat Yesharim, Path of the Just, which was published in 1740 by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, begins by saying, I haven't come to teach you new things. I've come to teach you things you already know but have forgotten. And I know from teaching, and I will sometimes say something and I see people are nodding, and they're nodding not because I'm teaching them something new, but because they're reminded of something they know, and it awakens that in you. And so the fact that we have a Jewish path of reawakening ourselves is very significant. The fact that we might not know the people who I'm drawing on is a very significant fact of the Jewish world. So I mentioned Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Ramchal, who published that book in 1740. We are heirs, we collectively are heirs to a Jewish tradition which was developed and maintained by extraordinary people of the not so distant past, which is what makes it also going back far. I mean, you can date Mussar itself back certainly to the 11th century and back into the 10th century for its roots, and that means 1100 years old. But a lot of what became the more developed Mussar path was developed in the 19th century. And that's really dating to Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, who started the Mussar movement in Eastern Europe in about 1850. And here we are in North America in the 21st century. And for the most part, certainly before you got involved with Julie and she took over your life, before that, I'm not making eye contact with her. Before that, our great spiritual seekers and teachers of the last 2 centuries were unknown to us, which is an incredible fact. So Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe, he died in 2005. That's not a long time ago. I'm not talking ancient history here. Everyone in this room was an adult at the time that Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe was living, and he wrote a book called Alei Shor, which, well, let me tell you a little bit about him. He was born and raised in an assimilated family in Berlin, and he went to the University of Berlin, and while he was there, he had a kind of spiritual awakening as a Jew. And he had been in an assimilated family. He didn't have much Jewish content, but he knew, or he found out, that there were these yeshivas in Lithuania where they focused on spiritual development and on spiritual life and spiritual growth and spiritual journey. And so he took himself from Berlin to Lithuania and took his Hebrew name. I think he was known as Wolfgang, and he became Shlomo. And he settled into the Mir Yeshiva, where he became a student of Rav Yerucham Levovitz. I've been studying the writings of Rav Yerucham Levovitz for the last 6 years, and his book, Dat Chochma Mussar. And I'm telling you this not so that you'll be able to pass the quiz, but to highlight the unknownness of it, the strangeness of it, the fact that this is a whole life that was going on that is our immediate ancestors. I'm talking 2005. And that these are our immediate ancestors, and we don't necessarily know them, and we were cut off from them. And when we had to find our way, I was in my teens, I was already very much starting to awaken to the idea of a spiritual life. I had inner questions. I was curious. I didn't know how to make sense of life, and I was searching. And do you think there was a Jewish door to knock on? I had no idea where to go with those questions, and certainly not to a Jewish world. There was no entry point. So I did what every good Jewish boy would do. I went to India. And I stayed in India for 3 years. And I look back, and again, like a lot of things in life, they make sense in hindsight. I don't have any regret about that, but I really see that had I been in Minneapolis and been a teenager now, I couldn't say what I said about my own upbringing. I couldn't say there isn't a door available. The list of synagogues that are sponsoring the event tonight is extraordinary. It means that the spiritual life of the individual has a place in the Jewish agenda. And I would say in my growing up in the Jewish world, and I suspect in the case of all of us, that the inner life, which is so important to us, that is our life. Our life is the inner life. It didn't have a place on the Jewish agenda in the years of our growing up. And there are reasons for that, and I talked about them a bit this morning. The whole thrust towards assimilation and melding in and just becoming part of the culture and becoming as much American as we could be, and I'm Canadian, so I'm just North American as we could be. We gave up a lot. So Reb Shlomo Wolbe, he was in the Mir Yeshiva under Rav Yerucham Levovitz when the war broke out. And the Mir Yeshiva was, if you don't know the story, it's an amazing story because they, and the entire yeshiva, and think of a group of students and teachers in an Orthodox yeshiva in Lithuania in 1940, got visas to Dutch Guiana. Now, if you don't know where Dutch Guiana is, think what they didn't know. And off they went, but because Lithuania was under the Russians, they were able to get transit visas to go east, and they went to Vladivostok, and then they went to Japan on their way to Dutch Guiana to get out of the Holocaust. The whole yeshiva went. And then Japan joined the war, and they were in Japan, and they were Russian, and Russians were on the other side, so they shipped them off to Shanghai, and they lived in Shanghai till 1947, running a yeshiva. It went there. The only problem for one individual was Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe couldn't go with them. The entire yeshiva escaped the Holocaust in that way that I just described, and he couldn't go with them. Why? Because he was a German. Because he had German citizenship. So all these people got transit visas through Russia. Well, they wouldn't give a German a transit visa through Russia. So he escaped to Sweden. And he lived out the war in Sweden and eventually made his way to Israel. And then he, as I said, lived to 2005. And he wrote this amazing book, Ali Shor, which to this day has not been translated into English, but I've studied it, and it's an amazing book. And his teaching revolved around one thing, and I'm going to tell you what that thing is and bring it eventually around to the subject of Shabbat. And if not now, in the question period, but because that's the problem of having an 1,100-year-old R&D department. You know, that I want to share a lot with you. I have to be disciplined, so that's a Mussar thing to do as well. But towards the end of his life, he had taught a lot of students, Rabbi Wolbe. He called all his students together for a conference, and he sat them on a horseshoe table, and he invited each of them in turn to stand up and tell the group what they had learned from him. And they went around the circle, and one stood up and said, Rebbe, from you I learned patience. Rebbe, from you I learned chesed, I learned kindness. From you I learned, and they went around, each one saying what they had learned. And when they had finally gone around the whole circle, Rabbi Wolbe put his face in his hands and he said, I have no talmidim, I have no students, he said. He said, all those things are wonderful, but that's not what I wanted you to say. What I wanted all of you to say is what you learned from me was hislamdus, or as we might say, hitlamdut, which means to learn, to teach yourself from your own experience, to analyze your life and your experiences and things you run into and be the teacher of yourself. And that's what I wanted you to have learned from me. And it's such an iconic story about Mussar and his teaching and focusing on hitlamdut, because it's not the books, they're important. It's not the teachers, it's not the VOD leaders, it's not the structure. They're all important because they teach you how to teach yourself. Your experiences, what you run into in life, all the situations. You know, I'm traveling around a lot. This is one stop on a 45-city book tour, which means if I get into it, I'll start telling you travel stories. And seriously, I mean, the time that my Uber driver started to cry, you know, I'm thinking to myself, can I hug my Uber driver? I know I wouldn't want my Uber driver to hug me, but she's crying. She's crying because she's from Iran, and she left an 11-year-old daughter when she left there 3 years ago, who is now 14, in Tehran as it's being bombed. And so she's crying. And then she drops me off at the airport. Actually, just before she drops me off at the airport, I get a text that my flight is canceled, you know? And all of it is life. And all of it is experience. And all of it can be processed through the lens of Mussar in order to practice hitlamdut, which is to be teaching yourself from life. To be teaching yourself, because you're experiencing things that are custom-made lessons just for you. If you put somebody else in exactly the same situation, that lesson wouldn't be there from them. You know, and many examples of that. It's because of your inner configuration that the situation becomes a test or a lesson, and you have something to learn. So I'm only one step away from Shabbat. So I'm going to give you this one step. When I went on my spiritual journey, 2 years of studying on my own, largely learning Chovot HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart, by Rabbi Bachya Ibn Pakuda, that was written in 1080. Let me repeat that, 1080. That's over almost 1,000 years ago. Duties of the Heart. I never encountered anything in the Jewish world that spoke to me like the title of that book. And then the book lived up to its title, focusing on the inner life. And then after that, I went and figured I needed to find out if I could find a teacher, because I had been looking into books that were like 1,000 years old, and I didn't know anything about any contemporary reality of Mussar. And then either through coincidence or through somebody helping me, or through an act from above, I got a connection to Rabbi Pear in Far Rockaway. And I phoned him and said to him, cold call, I've been learning Mussar on my own in Vancouver for 2 years, and I'm wondering if there's anybody out there who's has had an unbroken connection to this tradition who could maybe even be a guide for me, or certainly show me something about the tradition, not just books. Because you can't learn spiritual practice really from a book. You need it from a person, somebody who embodies it. And I tell a lot of stories about Rabbi Pear because there's stories about him because he represented the tradition, not just the books. And he said, I told him that, and then he said, wait a minute, you've been learning Mussar on your own in Vancouver for 2 years? I said, yes. He said, that's so inspiring. And I said, can I come and meet you? Anyway, he said yes. And I said, when can I come? He said, well, come to New York and phone me from there. I don't know if he knew where Vancouver was, but making a trip from Vancouver to New York in order to make a phone call is unnecessary. But I did. That's the nature of the spiritual journey. He said to me once, he said, sometimes, remember, you're hearing this from a Rosh Yeshiva in an Orthodox yeshiva. He said, sometimes you have to go right up to the edge of the cliff and fall over. And sometimes you just have to take off. So I went to New York and I called him and eventually met him, and then it went on from there. But all my impetus, and it shows up in the first 4 books, was to study Mussar. I wanted Mussar. I wanted this. I wanted this guidance system for inner living that had been passed through 11 centuries of Jewish refinement. I don't know how many generations in 11 centuries. I don't know, a lot. More than 11, more than 30 generations of Jews passing it down and down and down, and adding their own experiences and writing their own books and reading each other's books and refining it. And one of the interesting things is if you look into the tradition, you see that they were being written in different countries in different centuries, which means different circumstances, different technology, different political issues, different social and economic. And so it was working here and it was working there, and they were passing it on and adding their lessons, and it became something that was universally applicable because of that, because it wasn't developed for a single time and place. And so they developed it, and we developed it. It's ours, and then it got passed down, and that's what I was interested in. When my business collapsed, which sent me on the journey, and I had to look at myself, and I realized I just was not good at telling the truth, which is a really terrible thing to tell an audience when you're giving a talk. Believe me, I've worked on myself since then. Believe me. But I saw that, and I saw that I really didn't know, and I was so typical, and I am so typical, and I think that's part of the reason that I can teach, is because I'm just typical. I'm not special, and I saw that I didn't have any kind of sense of a compass, a guidance system. It was all about just making things work, but no sense that previous generations had been through the same things in different ways, but the same issues, and had developed an understanding of what we should do with human experience, how to practice hitlamdut. How can I teach myself from my experiences? What should I be looking for? What are the methods? What are the practices? A guidance system for living. Not because we're trying to fit ourselves into a box, far from it. Because if you are your own best teacher, you're not trying to be anybody else. We're trying to be ourselves, but live up to the potential that we all feel we have, and that's been given into us, and it is, in a sense, our obligation as our commitment to others, to be the best version of ourselves we can. I just had so much a sense that this was what I was looking for, and there it was, and practicing patience, and practicing generosity, and practicing kindness, and practicing, and the rabbi mentioned shame. You know, it's such an interesting thing that busha, the Hebrew word for shame, even that the Mussar teachers found a positive side to. Because and I'm staying with this theme for a moment, I'm not changing it. The notion that we all have all the inner traits and they themselves have no particular value, good or bad. They have no valence. Anger is not necessarily bad. Envy can be good. Envy is a motivator. Generosity, you can do so much harm with generosity. You can enable someone else. You can create codependency. You can spoil a child. You can undermine a fundraising campaign with generosity. And so, you know, the Christians have 7 deadly sins. And the Jews look at those 7 deadly sins and they say, they're not so bad. What do you get? Because anger has its role. Envy has its role. And so on. I don't know what all 7 of them are. I don't have any particular axe to grind with those 7. And this is what this was important to me. And I was learning, and it was so great. I was learning in the context of yeshiva. A lot of other things go on in the yeshiva. And I wasn't interested in them. They were studying Talmud day and night. They were doing prayer services. They'd be learning in the Beis Medrash, in the study hall. And at a certain point, someone would bang on the table, and they would all stand up, and it was mincha time, you know. And then it would finish, and they'd all sit down and go back to learning. And there were all kinds of stuff going on. I was just interested in the Mussar. I wanted this, and I wasn't interested in that. And I'm going back now 26 years. This was 26 years ago. And I mentioned this morning, and I'll repeat it as a review to those who were there this morning and new to the rest of you, that I asked Rabbi Pear, I said, can I do this? I see what you're involved in. I see all the things you're doing, but I'm only interested in the Mussar. I only want this inner spiritual guidance. Can I do that? Can I extract this piece? And his answer, he thought about it, and he answered, yes, I think you can. You can, he said. But I'll tell you, it looks like this to me. He said, you got a car, and you take the radio out of the car, and you put it on the table, and you wire it into the electrical system, and it works as a radio. If you want to get a radio, you take it out of the car, and you create a radio for yourself. He said, it'll work. That'll work, he said. I've never seen anybody do that, he said. And that was his metaphor for me taking Mussar out of the entire vehicle. And my first 4 books reflect that, because that's what I was interested in. And that's what I was exploring and fleshing out in my own life and sharing. And I feel great about that. I was going to say I feel fine about that. I don't feel fine. I feel great about that, because I think the Jewish world was so bereft of our own spirituality that it was a terrible disservice to Jews. And the result was, you know, as I said, good Jewish boy, I went to India. It's hard these days to do a Buddhist meditation course that isn't led by somebody named Kornfield, Goldstein, Schwartz, Salzburg, Burstein. And I didn't make up any of those names. You know who I'm talking about. You've probably done those courses. And that is not a reflection on them. That's a reflection on the Jewish world. Because most people don't leave home unless there's a reason to leave home. Unless they're missing something that they need at home, they go somewhere else to get it. And so I focused on making people aware of Mussar. That was my whole agenda. I would say in those days, my job is to show people there is a door, the door that was not available to me. It's not my job to take them through the door. It's still not. And I see what's happened. You know, I see all of you, and I see what has been built here in Minneapolis that is parallel to what's being built in Buffalo, which is very similar to what's being built in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and so on. That Mussar in our contemporary world has developed a life of its own, something I could never have dreamt of, that it's going and it's going and it's infiltrating and it's finding places. And rabbis, is Rabbi Zimmerman here? Did you learn about Mussar in HUC? Did you hear that? Not a word. Not a word. Do you realize how astounding that is? That the rabbis were not exposed. So no wonder the community was not exposed. And that was true for JTS, and it was also largely true in the Orthodox world, where Mussar came to be less and less and less and less featured. The inner life of the individual. In all areas of the Jewish world, we came to focus on the collective. We focused on the community. We focused on the institutions. We focused on the buildings. We focused on the schools. We focused on the collective. As for the individual, we just wanted to be Americans or North Americans, but the Jewish world, including the rabbinic seminaries, and therefore I felt, because I was benefiting in my own life, that I had to share that, and that was the first 4 books, and the Mussar Institute, and of course, all of that. When I'd been learning so much when I was with Rabbi Pear, that I said to him at one point, I'm thinking of writing a book. And that was Climbing Jacob's Ladder. And he said to me, you're thinking of writing a book? You're obligated to write a book. That's what he said. And I feel that. I felt that. It was like coming from a sense of, if I'm encountering this and this is so valuable and valuable in my life, then I'm obligated to share it with other people because it is ours. Not mine, not his, not anybody's, ours. And we were cut off from it. And we were not having access to it. So I felt that was very important. Meanwhile, I'm still getting exposed to all these other dimensions of Jewish life in which I had no interest, for which I was not at the yeshiva. But when you're around people who you admire, and I admired these people a great deal. You know, Julie mentioned I have my doctorate from Oxford University, and only 2 places I've been in my life have challenged me intellectually, really to a high degree. One was Oxford University, and the other was the Yeshiva of Far Rockaway. Really interesting people and very developed. And I was going to say that, I meant to say, and I'll just throw it in here, that I had to correct one thing about the introduction, which is that Rabbi Pear was my teacher. Rabbi Pear was one of my 2 teachers. The other one was Rebbetzin Pear. She was my teacher, and he was my teacher. And she is still alive, thank God. She is the great-granddaughter of the founder of one of the 3 schools of Mussar from the 19th century. She's the great-granddaughter of the Alter of Novardok. Incredible direct lineage. So you imagine how it was. Like, I was a person who had no lineage, spiritual lineage, with a person who was like an incredible spiritual lineage. But I was really focused on her husband. He was my primary teacher, and so he would fit me in at all kinds of hours of the day. We'd spend time together, and then often in their home. And so I'd be discussing, learning, spending time with Rabbi Pear, and Rebbetzin Pear would say, "Can I sit with you?" She would ask permission, and he would say, "Of course." She said, "I won't say anything." That would last 20 seconds, 22 seconds. He'd tell me a story, and immediately she'd say, "Yechiel, that's not the way my father would tell it over." And then he would say, "How would your father tell it over?" And she would then proceed to tell the same story he told in a different version. And then they would argue. And I'm sitting there, the third party in the room, going, I can't believe I'm here. Like, I can't believe this is happening. And so she was my teacher too. And my book, Everyday Holiness, is dedicated to my 2 Mussar teachers. And I want to acknowledge that because I think it's kind of an unusual fact that a Jewish spiritual tradition historically included a very significant place for women alongside men, not women, men, but women and men. And I really wanted to acknowledge that by dedicating that book to a man and a woman, both of whom were my teachers, and that's just a fact. So me, who's busy practicing Hitlamdut, starts to look at what's my resistance to this other stuff? What's my resistance to studying the Talmud? What's my resistance to prayer services? And I'm processing and processing. I can't help it. It's all life, and life is here to be processed and learn the lessons. And the one thing that really stood out for me, and really the only one which I really couldn't find any good reason to keep it out of my life, was Shabbat. Because it just was, and I especially saw it in the yeshiva world, in Far Rockaway, when it's time to light the candles on Friday, in the town of Far Rockaway in New York State, a siren goes to announce to the community that Shabbos is here. And it was a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful thing to set down the burdens of the week, because the burdens of the week are burdensome, and they're heavy, and they're difficult, and they're challenging, and they're distracting, and there's so much angst in our world, and we internalize it. But one day a week, put it aside. We'll go. It says that Shabbat is 1/60th of the world to come. It's like it's a taste of a paradisical life. And in a way it was. I could feel that. But so I said to my wife, because I didn't grow up with anything like that. My wife did a bit more than me. But in our house, raising the kids, we didn't do anything. Shabbat was Saturday. That was what it was. And so I said to Bev, my wife, I said, I think we should light Shabbat candles. And I told this story earlier, so again, it's a review if you were here this morning. I said, I would like to light Shabbat candles. And she said, okay, let's do that. It was no problem at all to do that. So we agreed. We had candlesticks. We had the candlesticks her grandmother had brought from Poland. And so we're set up by candles. And every Friday night we would light candles. When did we light candles? We lit candles when she finished her work. She's a physician. She is retired now, but she would see patients during the day. And after she had finished, when she was finishing all her patients, her next job was to write in her charts. And it was very important for her, and her patients were palliative. She was a palliative care hospice physician. And I used to joke with her when she was so pressured by her work, I would say, is there no tomorrow? The other thing I would say is that no one has yet survived her care. Anyway, but it was very important for her to finish writing in her charts before she was ready to let it go and relax into the restfulness of Shabbat, which meant that we would light candles 2 hours after sunset, a half hour before sunset, 45 minutes this way. It didn't matter. It had nothing to do with that. It had to, okay, my work is done. Now I can settle in. And then we did that. That's how we did it. And at a certain point, because I was still processing this, just processing, and I said to her that this was nuts, that the way we were doing it was 180 degrees wrong, and it didn't make sense because the timing of Shabbat is related to the setting of the sun. And the setting of the sun is related to the season, because it comes earlier or later, and it's changing every week. And the timing is based on the earth rotating around, revolving around. The earth is revolving around the sun. And meanwhile, it's rotating on its axis, right? And so the rotation on the axis and the revolving around the sun and the closeness of the earth to the sun makes it a different time of year. And when you light the candles at a certain time, that's what you're aligning with, right? You're aligning with these cosmic rhythms, and it changes from week to week because the cosmic rhythms are moving through patterns, and that's what you're aligning with. And 6 days a week, we pay no attention to that. We're disconnected from that. And once a week, we realign ourselves because there's a truth in that. And the truth is we are little beings on one planet hurtling through space around a star, And we lose sight of that whole thing. But once a week we realign, except not in our house. In our house, we're aligning to the charts. Like we're tied up with her work life. And so there was this discrepancy between this opportunity to align with the cosmic rhythms, and we're in her professional life determined by that. So I said, I really think we're doing it wrong. And then the fight started. Because it was so obvious to me that we should be lighting candles at the right time because of the sun and the moon, and not the moon, the sun and the earth and the rotation and the season. All of that was primary. We had an opportunity to align our lives, and we were still stuck in the charts and the finishing of work. And we got through it, and she learned through that she could stop working when she chose to stop working. That the work was not the master of her, she could be the master of the work. It wasn't finished, put it down. It is time to put it down. There's a discipline in that which is incredibly liberating. She was waiting to be liberated by finishing her work. Backwards. The power to put down your work is what's liberating. Otherwise, you're actually enslaved by the work. You think of it as liberation, but you're enslaved by the work. And so that freedom to put down her work, of course, was a power that she could use on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday as well, because she was now the master over that and had developed a quality in herself that established the right balance or the right positioning of her life, her spiritual life, and her work. It had been reversed. And that's what started me off on recognizing. So the book is called The Shabbat Effect. The point is that Shabbat is an opportunity to practice certain ways of being, which if you do, then they have a lasting effect the other 6 days of the week as well. And when you say the other 6 days of the week, it means your entire life, all 7 days of the week. And what it requires, and this was my own exploration, I had none of this, and no one pushed me into it. I just have been seeing, and this is the hitlamdut part, this is the teaching yourself. When you take a step and you look at it and say, what did I learn? You may find that the next step makes sense too. It's not about taking on something because it's in a book or someone tells you to. It's about experimenting in your own life. And so we experimented with lighting candles, and that started to align our lives differently. She started to see the effect on her work life, on her attitude towards her work life, and that was very inspiring to keep exploring more. And so what came out, and this is over several years, maybe 12 years of experimentation between me and my wife, just like that, in our home, was that a recognition that the world is really a very difficult place. And in those 12 years, it has only gotten more difficult. And it is really distressing. And I think when I look around and I see all the issues that are so prevalent in our world today and have so much impact on how we feel, on how we sleep, on how we eat, on how we treat each other, on how we talk to each other, on politics and divisiveness and hatred. And, I know I'm in Minneapolis, and I'm staying in a hotel, and I was walking down the hall, and I saw an arrow on the wall, and on my floor in the hotel, and it said ice. And I got nervous, but so I knew that these issues are even on the top of my mind. And the way we began to experience Shabbat was as a clearing away. 6 days a week is plenty to give to the world. And 1 day a week to clear that and create a space in which to bring other qualities, and those qualities which will not be there as long as we're stuck on our phones, as long as we're being inundated with the influences of this world, holiness, peace, rest, awareness, material satisfaction, trust. There are 8 chapters in the book, and they all focus on these inner qualities, which only will come into our lives if we practice them, and which I believe it's possible to practice them in the midst of the everyday, distressing, troubling world. It's possible. It's extremely difficult. It's really difficult. It requires a clearing away in order that though this day can be separated and made available as a space in which to bring these other qualities. So it's not just a day of kicking back. It's not just a day of taking a break from anything. It's not just that's only the half of it. The half of it is clear this away. The other half is what you do in the space. What do you bring into the space? And into that space comes things that are of high priority according to Jewish values, but also I think that the soul needs. The reason they're high priorities in the world of Jewish values is because this is what the soul needs. Last week's Torah portion, which was the one where my eldest granddaughter had her bat mitzvah last Shabbat. Thank you. She did very well. But it was Kedoshim, Parshat Kedoshim, the Parsha of holiness, where God says and instructs Moses to tell the Jewish people, Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. You shall be holy. And as my granddaughter said, the word Kedoshim is in the plural because it's addressing each of us as an individual, that holiness is what we are meant to bring into our lives. So at that moment, the Torah could have established any priority that it wanted, and that would be the priority of our life according to the Torah. And it's a holiness. Holiness. Where do we practice holiness? Where do you practice holiness? Where do you bring it into your life? Where is that the priority? Shabbat Kodesh, Holy Shabbat, which it says God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, by clearing away all which is mundane, then we have the possibility to practice holiness and to bring that in. And the same is true of all these other qualities. It is such an opportunity not just to realign ourselves to the cosmos, but to realign ourselves to ourselves. And that is a place I think we get very unaligned, very misaligned, largely because of external influences, because we're so tuned in. If you think of how many radio waves, I don't even know how they broadcast anymore, what's going through this room right now, how many channels, put it that way, are going through the air of this room right now? If you just take your phone and you would draw down through the Wi-Fi, it could be television, it could be radio, it could be podcasts, it could be TikTok, it could be social media, it could be, and it's all here right now. It's all flowing through this room right now. And I'm not saying that influence is direct, but we are tuned into it. We actually have the devices, we have the receivers, and we're plugged into all that, which is one of the reasons why one of the important things on Shabbat is the opportunity to unplug. But not for the unplugging in order just to rest and relax and recharge. No, to actively practice rest. It says, 6 days God created the world, and on the seventh day, God created only one thing. God created rest. It didn't exist before the seventh day. It had to be created. And if God had to create rest, so do we. We have to learn how to rest, learn how to be peaceful people. It's the only mitzvah that's given in the Torah about Shabbat, besides showing up on the Ten Commandments, is that you should not light a fire. And the Zohar says, even within yourself, don't get angry. It's a practice of peacefulness. And all these qualities, so what I saw in my own life and with my wife and became the substance of the book is that Shabbat is such an opportunity to cultivate yourself. Absolutely typical Mussar. Absolutely typical Mussar. Cultivate trust, cultivate peace, cultivate inner qualities. That's what we all know is the Mussar way. But the difference here is that the working context is coming out of Jewish normative practice. The thing that I wasn't interested in at the yeshiva, the other parts of the car, not the radio, the other parts of the car. And that became a big exploration for me, and hence the book, and hence sharing it with you, because that has been my journey. And I realized so profoundly as it became more important to me how much we have lost by giving up the Holy Sabbath and turning it into another day of the week, because it is such a place, an extraordinarily valuable place for spiritual practice, which requires a clearing out in order that we can bring in different. And I want to share a metaphor that I shared this morning, but it's in the book, so I'm entitled to keep repeating it, which is that when we bring in Shabbat on Friday evening, we raise a cup of wine, and then we make a blessing, and that action is called Kiddush, which means sanctification. And we're sanctifying the seventh day, which is an interesting thing because the seventh day is inherently sanctified. It says in the Torah, when God created the seventh day, God blessed it and sanctified it. We didn't have to do that, but we do. Why? We're aligning ourselves with the sanctification. Shabbat is about alignment. So we align with the cosmos, we align with ourselves, we align with the holiness of the day. Somebody asked me, I remember where, I don't always remember where, but this was West Palm Beach on my tour. She said, I love what you're doing about Shabbat. I love everything you say, but I'm so busy on Saturday. Do you think I could do it on Tuesday? And it makes sense in a certain way, but the part that doesn't make sense is the alignment part, because you are aligning with the reality of the seventh day as defined, first defined in the Torah, but the fact that everybody else, you gain such strength from the notion of we're all observing Shabbat. We gain individual strength from the community. So we raise the cup of wine in sanctification, and we make a bracha, a blessing, and the blessing is Borei Pri Hagafen, we bless the wine. And the cup doesn't get a mention. We don't talk about the cup at all. But we need the cup because you can't make Kiddush without a cup. Like, okay, you got a bottle of wine, you pop the cork, and you glug, 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 and now you make a bracha. You couldn't do that out of the bottle. And even if you weren't such a cretin, you put a straw. You put a straw in the bottle and you make a blessing over that. You can't do that. You need a cup. And anybody who has a Kiddush cup, they're usually very beautiful. There's a whole art of making Kiddush cups. I have a glass Kiddush cup from Venice. It's just so beautiful. But it doesn't get mentioned in the bracha. And there's a real message in that, which is that the point in Jewish practice is the wine. And the wine is the representative of spirituality. It is deeply colored. It is scented. It is transformed. It's not its original product. It starts out as raw material called grape juice, and now it becomes this elevated product called wine. And it itself is transformative because it has an alcoholic quality that transforms consciousness. And so wine is a beautiful representation of spirituality, but you need the cup. And that's what I came to realize about the Jewish paradigm, which is that the point of it is the spiritual. We are supposed to become holy, spiritual, the spiritual elevation. Judaism is structured and focused on, which is amazing given what our generation has been through, our inner lives, the spirituality of the individual. But you need a cup. Without a vessel, you have nothing to hold the wine. You've just got like wet socks. You need the cup. And the same is true, and I think Shabbat is like a cup in time. It's a cup that is a vessel, a firm vessel that can hold the spirituality. And after I published that metaphor in the book, I realized that the same thing is true of candle lighting. Because before we raise the cup, we light the candles. And in one hand, you've got a piece of wax with a string. At that point, you can't make the blessing. And in the other hand, you've got a flame. It's a lot like the wine. The wine is liquid. It's not solid. It's not stable. It flows like the Spirit. And the flame flows in its own way like the Spirit. And only when you bring the two together that you can make the blessing lahadlik ner, to kindle the candle. And I think that that's what I learned in the last 12 years. And it's been 12 years since I last wrote a book, since published a book. And in those 12 years, it's been recognizing the interplay of structure and spirit. And many people say, and I run into them all the time, and you probably do too, about people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I don't go to synagogue. I get my spirituality here, there, go to the forest, go to the seaside. That's my spiritual life. I commune directly. That can be spiritual. I agree. That can be. Those are spiritual experiences. What Judaism is structured to give us, what it wants to give us, and what it is set out to give us is a spiritual life, not a spiritual experience. And within the spiritual life, there will be spiritual experiences, but that's not the goal. The goal is to have a spiritual life, to have a life which by step and through practice and structure takes us higher and higher and higher up the mountain. And as we go up the mountain, if anybody has been walking or hiking or climbing, most of the time you're looking at your feet. Most of the time you're looking step by step. Very typical Mussar practice. What's the next word I'm going to say? What's the next action I'm going to do? How am I going to treat the next person I meet? You got your eyes on your feet as you go step by step. Periodically, you stand by the side of the mountain and you look out over the vista. And you see the world from your perspective. And then you come back onto your feet and you trudge, and you keep doing the daily work. And then you come to another vista point and you look out, but you've gone up higher. And the world looks different because you have a bigger vantage point because of the work you've done, because of the climbing you've done. And then you look back at your feet and you keep going. And as you go through life, you get these vistas, but it takes a structure. It takes practice. It doesn't come through wishful thinking. It doesn't come through momentary experiences. I say, God set up the world like Costco. How is that, you say? Because there are free samples at the end of every aisle. There are free samples of every experience. When I talk about looking out over the vista, no one asked me, I don't know what you're talking about. Everyone has had that experience. Everyone knows about all the things that I've talked about. They're like free samples at the end of the aisle. If you want to take the big box home, you have to be a member, you have to pay, you have to go through the cashier, you have to have a way of carrying that damn big box home. You almost have to have a card. You're obligated to have a card to shop at Costco. And so that's exactly what the spiritual life is. We have little tastes of it here and there, but if you want to take the big box home, that requires a structured practice. And we lost that in the Jewish world. We gave that up in the Jewish world. We went after other things, and it has not served us very well. Not as spiritual beings, but we weren't focused on ourselves as spiritual beings. And I think we've come back to it. And I think the reason why Mussar is proving so expansive right now is because it's answering the inner need that has always been there. And that this is what our ancestors developed to answer that inner need. And it does come with a pointer that structure is how we build a spiritual life. And a very good place to start is by giving yourself a Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. If anyone has a card with a question on it still remaining, please hold it up in the air and folks will walk around to gather them. I have a few here. And the first one really takes us right from where you left off. And this is a person asking, what would your advice be to a new convert who is seeking to implement Mussar practices into daily life?
So, one of the things that really appealed to me when I first came in contact with Mussar is, as I alluded to several times in what I was saying, is the fact that it is focused on the individual, as opposed to almost everything that I encountered in the Jewish world, which was really about the collective. There was no place to recognize or to, it wasn't built into normative practice that we're all different. You know, with the two people here who are identical, please stand up. And we're not. We're all individual. It says in the Talmud that when a human king stamps out coins, all the faces are the same. But when the King of Kings stamps out faces, they're all different. All right? And so that's true. We're all individuals. That doesn't show up normatively in most of the Jewish world. And Mussar reflects that individuality, the idea we're on our own spiritual path. We have to be. No one can do it for us. It's our own unique individual inner life. And so when someone is looking for a way to enter it, it again is individual. And that's true about Shabbat practice. It's true about everything. It's to say, Hitlam Dut. That's where I began my talk. Learn from your experience. So the thing about, you know, I didn't talk much about Mussar per se or the Mussar paradigm because I know most of you have been exposed to it already, but each of us has our own personal spiritual curriculum. Each of us has certain of the inner traits where we have a lot of room to grow in that one. We may be really good at patience, but we may be tight-fisted. Or we may be very generous and impatient, and so on. And that's the difference between each of us. It's not the trait. It's in us that it is calibrated toward an extreme, and that's where the issue comes up. And so I would say to that person, look at your own experience and see if there is a trait that keeps showing up consistently, which is problematic, which turns out to be problematic in relationships or in your work life or in your punctuality. And that is the first step on your spiritual curriculum, address that. And what I've learned, there are two kinds of progression, just to paint out the road ahead. One is the first things, that assignment is not difficult. Because when you first become aware that you have a spiritual curriculum, you've been handed a curriculum, there is something for you to work on, you've been given it, then the first set of issues is not hard to identify. They're like boulders on the road. The next set is like rocks on the road. Then it goes to gravel, and then it's sand. And and if you've been a hiker and you've got sand in your shoes, it's worse than having boulders on the road. You're tripping over subtle things, and you become aware. So that's a progression. It's not that it stops, but at least at the beginning point, there is probably something that if you don't see it, ask your spouse. They see it clearly. They see it. They know this is on your spiritual curriculum, because you're always late, right? You're always late. Or we're going out. There's always one of the two who are not ready, Like, how come it's always the same person who's not ready? The other one's in the car, and the first one is still like, again, changing shoes for the fourth time. And that shows you something that's on your spiritual curriculum, but you have to be a student of your own life. That's where the lesson comes. I said there would be another progression. The other progression is this. When you become a student of Mussar, you see what you did. As you progress as a student of Mussar, you see what you're doing. And when you get even more advanced, you see what you have choice about doing. So in the first instance, you're analyzing your life that you led because you weren't aware when you did it, you're aware looking back. Then you are actually aware that I'm telling a lie. Like as I'm telling it, or I'm getting angry, again, my travel stories, all the things that happen that trigger me. And then you see it's coming. And I see I have a choice. Okay.
I also would like to encourage anyone who's interested in cultivating a Mussar practice to reach out to the folks that are in this room that are actively involved in one, and to reach out to us at Living Mussar, because we'd love to connect with you. Hope you don't mind my plug.
No. All the more. I agree. I endorse. I underline.
The next question is, how do Mussar and Kabbalah intersect?
Okay, so when I went on my own spiritual journey, so I was 47 years old, and I realized I should go looking into the Jewish world. I call it a case of late onset Judaism. I had a case of late onset Judaism. And I started reading, and I can tell you exactly what, I read many different things, but one thing that really stood out was that Arthur Green edited a 2-volume set called Jewish Spirituality. It's an interesting book for 2 reasons. One is that it's organized chronologically. Spirituality in this era, spirituality in this era, spirituality in this era. And it starts like with Abraham, and it goes up. In fact, I ran into Mussar right near the end because it was focused on the Mussar movement, and that was 19th century. So we're going back to Abraham, Moses, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and you come up to the 16th century, and the Kabbalists, and it's all there. And then the Hasidim of the 18th century. You don't get to Mussar until right near the end. And I told you, I was like on my own, I was looking for something to satisfy my own inner need. And I came on Kabbalah, that section, that time period. It wasn't what I was looking for. I didn't know what I was looking for, but it wasn't that. And then Chassidut, same thing. And then I came to Mussar, and that satisfied me. And then I pursued that. But as I studied Mussar, I saw that in the Mussar tradition, there were intersections with Kabbalah. And once I was rooted in the Mussar tradition and came back to it, I came back to it with an appreciation I had not had. And so in the 16th century, when Kabbalah was really being, in its contemporary form, being formed in Tzfat by Rabbi Yitzhak Luria and Rabbi Moshe Cordovero and that whole crowd of Kabbalists, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero wrote a book called Tomer Dvorah. And anyone who's interested in the intersection of Kabbalah and Mussar should get that book. It's a small book. It's, it has a Kabbalistic framework because it's focused on Sfirot. But the content of each chapter on the Sfirot is about Midot. And so it's a Kabbalistic Mussar book. And then you can see through that how there is an intersection. Because on the one hand, Kabbalah is very metaphysical, and it gives a cosmological explanation for reality. And Mussar is very on the ground. It's very much where I've used the metaphor time and again. Your next step, how you treat the next person. The cosmology is not in the picture. Because you can have a beautiful cosmological picture, you have a perfect understanding of the tree of life, and you're not nice, And so that's not, but when you see what Rabbi Moshe Cordovero does to bring them together, you realize that there's a real possibility of wisdom through that.
Thank you. Can you offer some counsel about how Shabbat practice deepens Mussar practice? And how to manage challenge from family or friends? It's a really two-part question.
Really two-part question.
Right. So let's go with the first one.
Okay.
Some counsel about how Shabbat practice deepens Mussar practice with some specifics requested.
The word I'm not so sure about is deepens. I'll talk a little bit around deepens, and then we'll see. Why are you here? What is the purpose of life? It's a good question, no? And I've already alluded to what Torah says is the answer to that question, which is that you're here to be holy. And let's say we accept that as a working hypothesis. That's what you're here for. Then I have to say, where are you practicing holiness? Holiness per se, holiness itself. And the answer is, as I said, it's really difficult to practice holiness in the world that we live in with all its complexity and difficulty. Shabbat opens up the space in which that can happen in a much more direct way. So I don't know if that deepens Mussar practice or it just facilitates the whole process. That's one point. And the other point is it's just another form of Mussar practice. That's why I'm not sure about deepening. It's another way to cultivate inner traits. You know, I gave the example of my wife and the mastery over her work. One of the traits is, and I call it in the book, enoughness. Because one of the rules of Shabbat is you don't buy anything, you don't deal with money, you just don't have anything to do with acquiring new products, or even fixing something, or building something, or assembling something. Why? Because what you've got is enough. And one day a week, you step off the treadmill of acquisition, which this entire culture and economy is built to encourage us to step onto the treadmill of acquisition. And how are you going to get free? Like, where's the practice? You know, there's a lot of awareness about decluttering. Marie Kondo. Decluttering. From my point of view and a Mussar point of view, what decluttering is clearing more space for new acquisitions. Because you haven't dealt with the acquisitive motivation. You haven't dealt with the inner. Why did you end up with so much stuff? What do you have to do internally to stop acquiring so much stuff? Because you can declutter, you can do it on an annual basis, you know, because it keeps filling up. 70% of the garages in Los Angeles can't take a car anymore. Because we know this is us we're talking about. We all have too much stuff. And it's not good for the economy. Well, it is good for the economy, perhaps, or for GDP, but it's not good for the environment. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for the world. It's not good to be so acquisitive. It's not good for ourselves. It says in Ecclesiastes, no one leaves this world with half of their desires fulfilled. And so where do you practice that sense of material sufficiency? And that's the way Shabbat is a different kind of Mussar practice. I've been thinking in my mind all the way as I've been talking. Deepen? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's just a different form of Mussar practice in order to become a person whose inner traits are more elevated.
Mm-hmm. Given that there's a number of people in here who have been practicing Mussar for a year, 2 years, and many more, can you share what your intentions and hopes were for this book and how it might impact someone who has a base in Mussar and is looking to extend that connection with Shabbat?
Right. Everything that I have done has been an attempt to show people that there is something available to them, not to encourage them to do it. And so I feel about this book and Shabbat is that I'm pointing to something that will address something that we all, I think, or very many of us carry on a feeling that this world is so distressing that it is disabling, and that it is corrosive, and that it is wearing me down, and that I am losing sight of idealism and possibility and hope, and instead I just feel dread. I feel dread. I feel dread about tomorrow's news. I feel dread about what's going to happen. And we're living in that state, and a lot of it is justified. It's true, but not to the point of taking over our inner lives. Not to the point of taking over this gift of life. And so by pointing to Shabbat practice, what I'm hoping for is that people will see that Judaism has given guidance to other generations and other times and places the value of having a spiritual day, a day of cultivating certain inner traits that will help us to be people who can not only cope, but who can thrive. So Brett Stevens, the New York Times columnist, did a talk at the 92nd Street Y in New York. I guess it's about 2 months ago now, in which he talked about the way anti-Semitism has come to dominate the Jewish world, so that we are, as he was saying, we're in a sense in a defensive position. Somebody else is calling the agenda, and we're in the responsive position to that. And he was saying there is another approach, not to say ignore that, but there's an additional piece, which is to say cultivate Jewish thriving. Not to be in defensiveness about other people's initiative, but to build up the intrinsic and internal strength and thriving of the Jewish world. And in his article, or in his talk, he pointed to that, which I think is a lovely idea, except he didn't offer anything that speaks to the issue of Jewish thriving. He did say one thing. He said we should have more day schools, which is fine, except it's hardly a new idea. And we should fund more day schools, fine. But how can Jews thrive is a very good question. And I think that that's worth asking, because what's the point of a life? I think point of a life is to pursue holiness, but that's only a sense of a goal. It is to thrive. And the Torah says, I put before you life and death. Choose life. And Shabbat is a great opportunity to thrive. It's a great opportunity to thrive. And the Yiddish writer Achad Ha'am said, more than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. And that's where this is coming from in me, is seeing that there is a thing within our tradition which is available. And I'm pointing. And I'm saying to people, take a look, hitlamdu, teach yourself. And I'm also saying, and I haven't said it, so you can't say I'm saying it, but I will say, and I've said it in other contexts, that all spiritual practice is step by step. My teacher, Rabbi Pear, always talked about growth, and what he pointed out was that when you grow, you can't skip steps. When plants grow, they don't skip a stage. They grow molecule to molecule, cell to cell, and that's true for us too. So if anything that I'm saying resonates with you about Shabbat, what I'm suggesting is just, I gave you an example of what we did. We started lighting candles. That's it. One little step in that direction and see what happens. See if you're drawn into it. Learn from your own experience. And I would say, if someone said to me, I'm so motivated by what you're saying, I'm going to take on the whole thing. Like I'm Shomer Shabbos from this day forward. I would say, don't do that. Don't do that. For 2 reasons. One is, if you've been studying Mussar, you may know the concept of the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is your inner impulse that wants you to fail. And if you say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to run a marathon in less than 2 hours, here I go, right? And you're bound to fail. And there's that inner impulse that affects some people. Some people, they're going to say, I'm going to do the whole thing. Other people, because of who we are, the Yetzer Hara says, don't bother. Don't bother. Everything's fine. This is just, propaganda. And so but we have to look inside ourselves. But the way that I learned and that I saw it, and I'm pointing to this, is little incremental steps. That is a way to grow in the practice.
So this will be our final question. And I wonder if you might tie this question about how to manage challenge from family or friends with a choosing to become more observant of Shabbat or taking on Mussar practice. And I wonder if you would tie that in with the Salanter teaching about taking care of the neighbor's stomach and our own soul. And if that doesn't connect with you, then however you want to.
There's a lot of complexity in that question. Rabbi Pear once said, I came out to Far Rockaway and I was going to meet with him, and I had been in New York City. And I came out and he'd been thinking about my coming there, and he said to me, I want to say 2 things to you. He said, I want to say, don't go to extremes and don't go faster than your wife. Those were his two teachings to me that day. And the don't go to extremes relates to the thing I talked about previously. But the don't go faster than your wife relates to the question, because it's interpersonal. And the question was dealing with your, as I understood it, something with difficult family members and so on. It's again Yetzer Hara to say, I'm so committed to having a Shabbat practice, I don't care about you. Right? I don't care what you want. I'm doing it. And you can, whatever. And so Rabbi Pear's guidance to me always was to, in a sense, lead the family, not breach the family. Because if this is good, and I see it's good, and I think it's good for people, it's good for my family too. And I may, the example of us lighting candles, it was me who had the revelation that we should be aligning with the cosmos, but that didn't mean that I left my wife, And so that idea of working with other people, and the other piece that you were bringing in from Rabbi Salanter has many dimensions to it, because what it's saying is essentially Jewish spiritual practice happens with people, not by separating yourself from people. Other traditions, other religious spiritual traditions, have people who are living in monastic cells out in the desert, and like a friend of mine who joined a convent in which once you take your vows, you never speak again, which means, as I said, it's not a Jewish practice. Elie Wiesel said, there's a lot in the Jewish tradition about silence, but we don't talk about it. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan said, someone asked him if there's humor in the Talmud, and he said, yes, there are jokes in the Talmud, but they're very old. But Jewish spirituality is with other people, and that is partly because that's where the biggest tests arise. You like to be spiritual, and so what do? You take yourself by yourself out into the forest where the robins and the cardinals don't bother you at all. But you see your family, and they're not quite like the robins and the cardinals, they're like nuisances. And, I think I quoted earlier, someone said that, no wonder my mother pushes my buttons, she installed them. And who pushes your buttons most? The people you're closest to. What does that mean? You have the most to learn in those situations. That's your workout room. That's where your spiritual curriculum is going to show up. I've traveled a lot on airplanes. I meet the nicest people sitting beside me on airplanes. They're not at all like my family, My family's annoying, but they're not. And because I have no real relationship and I have no investment, and we're being so superficial. But with the people you're close with, you're not superficial. You're right down there. And so working with other people, and not just working with them in terms of your own spiritual curriculum. Well, yes and no, because your own spiritual curriculum includes taking care of them. So it's not solipsistic spirituality, it's not narcissistic spirituality. And the quote from Rabbi Salanter that Julie referred to was, he made an unequivocal statement. He says, spirituality is higher than materiality. Spirituality is higher than materiality. And he's right, because when you talk about thriving, as I did earlier, that's a spiritual quality. People could have billionaires and be such miserable people. And that's not going to do it. Where will you thrive? You thrive from within. And you thrive spiritually, and that is clearly a higher priority than the material. And Rabbi Salanter nailed that. But he said, but the material needs of other people are my spiritual need. I can't grow spiritually without taking care of the material needs of other people. That's part of the Jewish spiritual process. You can't just be sitting on your cushion and thinking nice thoughts. It's just that's not the Jewish way. Because we are in integration with people, we are part of the community, and we grow spiritually by being engaged with other people.
Let's take that in. Take a deep breath in together. Thank you for giving us so much to digest, to inspire, to think about, and to move our practice forward. Our practice of living this life in community with one another and continuing to grow and build this community together. A quick announcement and then a blessing. After we head out of here, there's a beautiful dessert reception, and you're invited to stay and nosh and connect. Alan will be at a table that you are welcome to come and meet him, talk with him if you wish. And please don't leave tonight without your Shabbat swag bag. And thank you to Jody Seltzer for providing us with those. Beautiful Shabbat candles and matches and a blessing and a little bag where you can put your phone on Shabbat if you want to try taking a little break. Also, there will be book sales available, and for those of you that pre-ordered, you can go right to the Majors and Quinn table and pick up your book. And thank you to Robin Alwind for the beautiful bookmark, the letterpress Shabbat and Mussar bookmark. The blessing. Friends, may we carry this evening's inspiration into the reception as we continue connecting with one another. And may we take that connection out into our world, reminding ourselves and each other that we are builders of this world and that we can raise each other up into becoming our best selves together. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Julie.